September 1st, 1939. German tanks crossed into Poland. The world officially entered World War II. But 24 hours earlier, in a place most history books never mention, a battle had just ended. A battle that decided whether World War II would look anything like what we know today. Most people have never heard of the Khalkhin Gol River. It sits on the border between Mongolia and Manchuria, a flat, dusty steppe that stretches as far as the eye can see. No great cities, no strategic ports, just grass, wind, and the bones of the men who died there. And yet, what happened on that river in the summer of 1939 may have saved the Soviet Union, reshaped the Pacific War, and determined the outcome of the entire conflict. This is the story of the most important battle nobody talks about. To understand why this battle mattered, you need to understand what Japan was planning. By 1939, Japan was already at war with China. But inside the Japanese military, there was a debate, a fierce, dangerous debate, about which direction the empire should expand next. One faction wanted to go north. They called it the Northern Road. The plan was to drive through Siberia, seize the vast natural resources of the Soviet Far East, and crush the USSR before it grew too powerful. These were the army generals. They had maps. They had ambitions. They had years of momentum behind them. The other faction wanted to go south, into Southeast Asia, into the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies, and eventually into direct conflict with the United States. The Navy called this the Southern Road. The entire strategic direction of Japan, and therefore the entire Pacific War, came down to one question: which faction would win? In 1939, the Northern Road generals finally got their chance to prove themselves. On May 11th, a small group of Mongolian cavalry, perhaps 70 horsemen, accidentally crossed a disputed border into Japanese-controlled Manchuria while searching for grazing land. Japanese soldiers drove them back. It should have been nothing, a minor incident on a forgotten frontier. But both sides escalated, fast. Within days, small skirmishes became large engagements. Both Japan and the Soviet Union began pouring men, tanks and aircraft into this remote corner of the world. Japan sent its Kwantung army, the pride of the imperial military. These were battle-hardened soldiers, veterans of years of brutal fighting in China. Their commanders were confident, their morale was high, and their fighting spirit bordered on fanaticism. By June, both sides had hundreds of aircraft in the skies above Khalkhin Gol. The air battles were enormous, among the largest aerial engagements of the entire pre-war period. And in those early weeks, Japan was winning. Soviet losses in the air were catastrophic. For every Japanese plane shot down, the Soviets were losing 4. Stalin was furious. So he sent his best. Georgy Zhukov arrived at Khalkhin Gol as a relatively unknown general. He had survived Stalin's brutal purges of the military, purges that had executed or imprisoned nearly half of the Soviet officer corps. He was careful, precise, and burning with quiet ambition. What he found when he arrived was not encouraging. Soviet forces were disorganized. Supply lines stretched over 600 miles of empty, featureless steppe. The men were exhausted. The commanders were confused. Zhukov looked at the situation and immediately began planning. Not a defense, an offense. While Japanese generals were drawing up plans for their own infantry assault, an attack they were certain would break Soviet lines, Zhukov was preparing something they had never faced before. In total secrecy, he assembled a strike force unlike anything this forgotten frontier had ever seen. Almost 500 tanks, 350 armored vehicles, nearly 600 aircraft, over 50,000 soldiers. Supply convoys moved only at night. Radio silence was absolute. Noise discipline was so strict that engines were wrapped and covered to hide the sound of the build-up. The Japanese had no idea what was coming. On August 20th, 1939, at exactly 5:45 in the morning, Zhukov launched his assault. Soviet bombers struck Japanese positions before a single soldier had crossed the line. Then the tanks moved. Both flanks hit simultaneously, a massive, coordinated encircling movement that mirrored the ancient tactics of Hannibal at Cannae and would later define the greatest battles on the Eastern Front. The Japanese infantry, trained for frontal assault, for bayonet charges, for hand-to-hand combat, had no answer for hundreds of armored vehicles converging from multiple directions at once. Within days, the entire Japanese force on the west bank of the Khalkhin Gol was completely surrounded. The Japanese command ordered their soldiers to hold, to fight to the last man. And many of them did, refusing to surrender even when totally encircled. Even as Soviet artillery and aircraft reduced their positions to ash and rubble.
By August 31st, one single day before Germany invaded Poland, the Battle of Khalkhin Gol was over. Japan had suffered between 18,000 and 45,000 men killed and wounded. Soviet losses were also heavy, around 25,000 casualties. But on the ground, the result was unambiguous. The Kwantung army had been shattered. What happened next is where history quietly and permanently changed direction. The generals who had championed the Northern Road were disgraced. The dream of conquering Siberia was finished. Japan signed a ceasefire. And then, 18 months later, in April 1941, a full non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union. When Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa against the USSR in June 1941, he expected Japan to attack from the east. It was part of the Axis strategy. Japan was supposed to stretch Soviet forces to the breaking point, opening a second front that Moscow could never survive. Instead, Japan looked south, toward Pearl Harbor, toward the Philippines, toward the Southern Road. And because Japan turned south instead of north, Stalin was able to do something extraordinary. In the fall of 1941, with German forces just miles from Moscow, with the city's museums evacuated, its government preparing to flee, Stalin made his decision. He pulled 12 full combat divisions from the Soviet Far East. Over 250,000 fresh troops, equipped for winter combat, ready to fight. They could only be moved because Japan was not attacking from the east. Those divisions arrived in Moscow just in time. On December 5, 1941, in the brutal cold outside Moscow, the Red Army launched its counter-offensive. The Germans, exhausted, freezing, their supply lines broken, their equipment failing in temperatures of -40 degrees, were pushed back for the first time. It was the first major German retreat of the war. Hitler's dream of a quick Soviet collapse was over. The man who commanded those far eastern divisions that saved Moscow, the same man who later stopped the Germans at Leningrad, fought at Stalingrad, and led the final assault on Berlin, was Georgy Zhukov. The same Georgy Zhukov who had been an unknown general 2 years earlier. The same man who stood on the banks of the Khalkhin Gol River and planned an encirclement that nobody expected. History often feels inevitable in hindsight. The Allies won. Germany fell. Japan surrendered. It all seems like it was always going to happen that way. But it wasn't. There was a river in Mongolia, a river whose name most people have never heard, where a battle was fought between forces that most history books ignore, in a conflict that officially didn't even exist. And on that river, in the summer of 1939, the course of the most destructive war in human history quietly shifted. One battle, on a forgotten steppe. And the ripples reached Moscow. They reached Pearl Harbor. They reached Berlin. If Japan had won at Khalkhin Gol, the Northern Road generals would have marched into Siberia. The Soviet Union would have been fighting on two fronts when Hitler struck in 1941. The divisions that saved Moscow would never have arrived. Zhukov might have died in disgrace or been shot by Stalin. Moscow might have fallen. The entire war might have ended in a very different world. We will never know for certain. But we do know this. The world you live in today was shaped, in part, by a battle you have probably never heard of. And now you have.